Do any of you remember the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars? Welcome to my channel. I focus on tabletop role-playing games, video games, and science fiction. On March 23rd, 1983, President Ronald Reagan made a speech about the Strategic Defense Initiative. This kicked off SDI, which the press named as Star Wars. It's a fun little tidbit of information. For those of you who are familiar, if you're a Star Wars geek, you know that George Lucas didn't complain when they used the Star Wars logo on all the nightly news, which is why the original logo of Star Wars, the trademark, was removed, because he didn't defend his trademark against all the news organizations. Because George Lucas didn't particularly care for Ronald Reagan and didn't particularly want to defend he kind of liked this analogy that it was Star Wars. My major at the time in college was physics. This was just amazing. This was an amazing thing because it was talking about pumping billions of dollars into research into physics. And yeah, people are going, oh man, there's going to be lots of money. Anyway, there was some interesting. The reason that I'm bringing this up is that just recently, the Pentagon fired an interceptor missile, and the press talked about, what was $40 billion later, Pentagon's missile defense finally scores a hit. We shot down an ICBM after the launch phase. Now, for those of you who possibly remember this, Star Wars, this was impossible. There were two groups. The physics community split almost equally, not quite, but it split between people who said you could never shoot down a missile after the launch phase. What I mean by that is that when it's under boost, the rocket isn't going as fast, the missile isn't going as fast, and it's an easier target to hit. But you have to go through the atmosphere to re-enter to hit it, which they viewed as a much easier problem to solve than to, once it goes ballistic, that you engage it, because now it doesn't have it's got a heat signature, but it's not quite as intense as during the launch phase, and it's moving much, much faster. But we shot one down. That was the missile hit. The Daily Beast, I'll put the link down in the description below. They were wrong. We're talking, they said, after 20 years. No, it's after 35 years. Because it goes back to the initial Star Wars, the initial SDI statement from Ronald Reagan. This is what Ronald Reagan wanted to put in place. It was taken, and I said that the physics department was split in half because there were a bunch of people said, oh no, you can never do that, it's just impossible. And then the other half of the people go, it's just an engineering problem. If that's sort of an inside physics joke. Unless you were a physics major, you probably won't get that joke. But it was just an engineering problem. You just had to figure out how to do it. There was nothing in the physics that said you couldn't do this. So we shot down a missile just recently. And this was interesting because I was a teaching assistant at the time, and it was interesting. I did a couple of little tidbits about this. Actually, the physics department was a little bit freaking out about Russia at this time. The story, and I can't document it because I have no idea who to look for and how to find this one, was President Reagan was in office, and some things were happening, but and I'll talk about what he did and how he affected the physics department, which normally wouldn't think was happening even before the Strategic Defense Initiative. But what happened, the story goes that I was told, was that some physicist was doing some research, doing a research paper, digging through, and he's got a mathematical problem, a problem that he's working on, and he starts doing research, and he finds an article and it references a German article. So he goes and gets the German article, and there's a translation of the German article, and he's reading through the German article, and he goes, wait a second, what's this? And he's going, there's a whole bunch of mathematics that he's not seen before in this German article. And he goes, where did this come from? So he looks into the German article, and this is a West German article. Mind you, this is before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany. And he looks in there, and he's seen all the references, and he looks up the English reference, and there's a reference from the German article to some other German articles who were published on the communist bloc from East Germany. So he goes and gets those. Now those he had a harder time finding translations of those and so on, and he finally gets these East German articles, looks up, and they're finding is more mathematics that he's not seen. It's a certain class of problem called a stiff problem. That means it's very difficult to solve. It's a class of problems that are really mathematically complex, and there was no known easy solution to this category of problems. And at least I'll go on with the story. So he's seen that they're solving this problem and this category of problems. And he looks up the references to that, and the references are to a bunch of Russian papers. And he goes and gets copies of the papers. Papers are read. The Russian version of the papers are published. He gets those. He can't read them, takes them to the Department of Languages, and he keeps digging back. And it says, lo and behold, the Russians had found solutions to an entire class of stiff problems. They'd published their report, the results, and they'd been known for years, but no one in the West knew about them because those papers had never been translated into English. And what happened under Reagan, this was brought up in physics. So Reagan affected the physics community intensely because of SDI, but he also made a change in the way things were translated. And the way the press reported this, I remember, because what they did was they reallocated the funding for translations. And the press freaked out because Playboy, the magazine Playboy, was translated into Braille, and they took funding away from that. And they said, oh, all these poor blind men who could no longer read Playboy. Well, what happened was the funding was actually reallocated to translate other articles, including Russian articles. Oh, they wanted to translate all Russian. Now, it made absolute sense what was going on in a political sphere. Physics is the most expensive science to do research with because they deal with big things. You need rockets, you need atomic colliders, you take a look at all the things that are there. You need nuclear power plants, you need to, the whole thing, the Manhattan Project, all of those things were extremely expensive. Arguably, the Apollo project is a physics project. It's just Newtonian physics, but it's physics. Whereas mathematics is the cheapest hard science, and I'll say hard science, to do research in. Unlike physics, where you need to do all these experiments, in math, it's all just thinking and paper and pencils. And so the argument was that. So what had happened was the Russians, realizing they needed to keep up technologically, they came up with an interesting plan. They started paying math professors fairly well. They started giving them very good, comparatively good salaries. The math professors in Russia made a much better living than, say, a math professor in the United States in compared to others. It's because they could give them money and they would do the research, and it proved out they had solved a certain class of problems that were papers, and they were publishing their papers internationally, but nobody was getting them translated. Whereas in the United States, we were putting more money into physics and so on. And that brings up, I got to tell another joke that most people won't get, but it was the joke, if you know a bunch about math and physics, maybe you'll appreciate this one. The story goes, a physics professor has got a bunch of problems and the math is getting really hairy and his grad students are having a problem. So he goes to the chairman of the department and says, can I get some help working through some of the mathematics? And so the chairman of the physics department says, okay, I'm having dinner in a couple of days with the chairman of the math department, and we'll see if we can get some grad students from the math department to help you. And they, great. So they go off, and there's an arrangement made between the physics department and the math department. And a bunch of grad students in the math department started working on this. This goes on for a couple of weeks, and the physics department hears nothing from the math department. They hear no progress reports, and finally they push and they go, the two chairmen get together, and the chairman of the math department says, great news. The physics department says, have you made any progress? He says, great news. We've made major progress. Oh, really? He says, yes, just the other day we proved there's a solution. That's a truly inside joke. I smile and laugh, but you have to appreciate the difference between math and physics to truly appreciate that one. Very inside joke, and I'm not going to try and explain it. But I have to smile because it just makes me laugh. But it's a funny... It's the difference in that math is much more abstract, and here the Russians had put a bunch of money into research into mathematics, which proved out. And they published their results, but we started translating. So Reagan changed the priorities of what was translated into what language, and there were other things that were going on. They changed the way that what was printed, which I disagreed with at the time, and I still am sort of irritated at. There was the GPO, General Government Printing Office, used to print at very low cost a bunch of mathematical books. They were books that had been researched by the government, and they were a series of tables and so on, and they were extremely expensive to produce, and the government was selling them at rock bottom prices, below cost. They actually were. And Reagan changed that, which unfortunately I wish I had bought the books before he changed them, because what had happened was there was a book which was, I didn't have the money at the time. For $20 you could have got, I think it was like about $20, you could have got the hardback, nicely bound copy that was produced by the GPO. And at the same time, there was the exact same book was available for $50 in paperback from a third party. Well, what happened was the government under Reagan changed the price because it was viewed as we were selling it under a price and we were competing with that. It's that they upped it to, I think, over $120. Made it really outrageously expensive, and the paperback for the hardback and the paperback was there. And I think eventually the government quit printing those, because they said the free market can print them. Part of me argues that, okay, it made sense, but I really wish I'd got in on the deal, and I didn't, because I didn't have the money at the time. But it was one of the textbooks for the class I was doing TAing on computational physics. So it's interesting. Here, wrapping up with Star Wars, it's taking, since 1983, it's now 2017, that we finally were able to shoot down a missile in the ballistic phase. And the press doesn't realize, there's nothing I've seen in the press about this goes back to Ronald Reagan, but this was what Ronald Reagan wanted for the Strategic Defense Initiative. It took a long time to achieve. And I know all those people who said, oh, we will never be able to do that. We will never be able to do that. That was the classic argument. We can't do that. It's impossible to do that. We've just now proven that we can do that. And it's important because you stop a rogue nation like North Korea. But it was designed to shoot down things that went on going back to the Soviet Union, to be able to shoot down missiles, because Reagan was the one who rejected what was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And I guess I should call this one quits because I could pontificate about this a bit. The United States adopted MAD. For those of you who don't read, why do you know why our interstate system exists? The interstate system exists because in the 1950s we decided to build there. Well, it goes back to the Bay of Pigs and the Korean Missile Crisis caused some problems with our troops being able to try and move them to Florida. And what happened was they decided to build an interstate, and part of it, the funding, was to come from the Defense Department, because the idea was every overpass could be a civil defense center. And that was shot down because that meant that civilians could survive. And there was actually one of the first ones built was in Salt Lake, and I knew that they called it the Viaduct, and it actually became an area of where the homeless lived because it actually was designed as a civil defense center that was then abandoned because it was viewed as that was an aggression toward the Russians to defend against nuclear destruction. Yeah, there were we've done some stupid things in the past. And the Russians never fully believed in mutual assured destruction. Actually, there's some of the stories that came out from that. They never believed in it. And part of it is the psyche that how many men that they lost in World War II. And they survived. We don't fully appreciate how World War II affected Russia and the people of Russia and the Soviet Union. And although they had many problems with their leaders there, but it did affect the psyche of the people with good cause because they lost so many men in the war. But they realized that they could survive after losing that many people, so they never accepted the concept of mutual assured destruction. And they didn't want to go to the other extreme, which Reagan was proposing, which was called mutually assured survival, which was the idea when we would share our technologies, but that never happened either. But it was the SDI. But it's interesting to see that now we shot down a missile, and people are going, great, we're protecting us against rogue nations like North Korea. And I go, this was planned. And for me, I got a soft part in my heart for this because, you never forget your first love. And I guess one of my first loves, shall we say, was physics. And I wanted to go into physics. My ideal job was weapons research design at Los Alamos Laboratories. And then I got, the phrase I use is I was seduced away by computers. But yeah, I still have a soft part in my heart for physics. And the fact that we shot down a missile is amazing because I know that people had said that was impossible. And there's no press on this. And that's sort of a shame. And there's no press giving credit back to Ronald Reagan for pushing this because that was what he wanted. And if you take a look at some of the other stories about what they intended and some of the and it goes way back. I've always been a science fiction fan. That Heinlein made a statement that there's no defense from space. And if you haven't read it, I suggest reading "Moon is a Harsh Mistress," where it talks about the moon fighting for independence from the Earth after it's been colonized and so on. And there's no defense from space. And then we have the SDI, which was there. It's the argument that there is sort of a defense, but the technology is hard. Don't get me wrong, the technology is hard, but it's sort of interesting. So I just had to do this one because I think the Daily Beast number is low. I think they're first off, their years, we're saying after 20 years, it's much longer than that, and I think their budget is low. We've spent more on that over the research because we've researched other weapons. You can look up the X-ray laser. There's the whole interesting argument about why we need atomic testing because we needed that put an end to the testing of the X-ray lasers. Because anyway, there's a whole bunch of stories there. I could go on. There are a whole bunch of things with there, and maybe I get a gleam in my eye because this was fun stuff to me. This was really exciting to me, and I just had to give something that's there. If you truly love the concepts of physics and so on, this is a major achievement. We shot down a missile in the ballistics phase, and the press doesn't realize just how amazing that was and what the ramifications of that are, that we can defend against that. Today, you don't hear people arguing, oh, we shouldn't be doing this research because it will offend somebody, like it'll offend the North Koreans. We're scared of this madman there, which was always a potential that we had people with nuclear weapons and some madman who has that. So but this goes back to the initial SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, which they renamed, which was eventually renamed and eventually disbanded. But it was Ronald Reagan who started this back in March 23rd of 1983. And I just had to do this one because this was exciting to me. This was when this happened in the news, and I haven't seen much about people talking about this one. And I just have to smile. I got a big grin on my face because this is an amazing feat that we've landed things on comets, we've landed things on Mars, we've done things, but now we shot down a missile in the ballistic phase, which is impressive and has probably very practical applications, as the saying goes, because we're all sort of worried about this person in North Korea. So, give me your comments. Does anybody else realize just how impressive this was? Did you read and eagerly get excited about this, that like I have been? It's just been exciting. There have been other things in the news which have been depressing, but this was the thing that made me smile, that we were able to do this. Love to hear your comments. Thank you for watching my video. I look forward to learning what you think about this video. Let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, press the thumbs up button. You can subscribe by clicking the link in the lower left. If you are interested, there are links to more content.